Somewhere in a limestone cave in what is now northern Spain, archaeologists found something strange. A thick layer of ash, over 3 meters deep, built up in slow, careful layers for thousands of years. Not one fire, not one flood, thousands of fires, lit again and again in the exact same spot, generation after generation. At first, that doesn't sound shocking until you realize what was happening outside that cave. Climate records pulled from ice cores and cave stone show this region wasn't just occasionally wet. For stretches lasting years, sometimes decades, the rain barely stopped. Rivers overflowed, valleys turned into swamps, the ground itself refused to dry. And somehow, humans didn't just survive it, they kept the fire burning the entire time. That's the mystery we're solving today. How did ancient humans survive endless rain when one bad storm today can flood entire cities and cut off power for weeks? Before we get into it, if you like uncovering the hidden survival secrets of our ancestors, hit subscribe and tap that bell, because these stories get stranger the deeper we dig. Okay, back to the rain. Here's the big question. Rain doesn't just make you wet, it kills. Wet skin loses heat 25 times faster than dry skin. Wet firewood means no fire. No fire means no warmth, no cooked food, no protection from predators, and no way to dry your clothes before the next storm hits. In a world without waterproof jackets, without concrete shelters, without weather forecasts, a week of non-stop rain should have been a death sentence. So why wasn't it? The obvious answer seems simple. They hid in caves. Case closed, right? But there was a problem. Most caves aren't naturally dry. Cave floors flood. Cave mouths funnel wind and water straight inside. And plenty of early human sites weren't even caves. They were open plains, riverbanks, and coastlines, exactly where rain hits hardest and floods first. If shelter was this easy, we wouldn't be finding evidence of such extreme, deliberate effort to keep fires alive. So archaeologists started looking closer, and that's where the first clue appeared. At several ancient sites, researchers noticed something odd about the placement of ancient hearths. They weren't randomly placed, they were consistently positioned near the back wall of shelters, angled away from the entrance, often slightly elevated on higher ground. That's not an accident, that's engineering. Early humans were reading water before it arrived. They understood that rain doesn't just fall, it flows, it pools in low points, it rushes toward entrances. So they built and lived slightly higher, slightly deeper, slightly angled, small decisions that meant the difference between a warm night and a flooded, deadly one. But this created a new mystery. Positioning your fire correctly doesn't matter if you don't have dry fuel to burn. So where did dry wood come from during weeks of non-stop rain? This is where the investigation gets interesting. Excavators studying prehistoric campsites found something surprising in the debris. Bark. Not just any bark, birch bark, stripped and stored in specific spots, tucked under rock ledges away from rain contact. Birch bark contains natural oils that make it burn even when slightly damp. It's essentially ancient fire-starting technology, and it required humans to plan ahead, to gather it before the rain came, not during it. That single detail flips everything we assumed about cavemen. These weren't people reacting to weather, they were forecasting it. And once you start looking for foresight, you find it everywhere. Excavation of ancient shelter frameworks reveals something else too. Post holes, deliberate holes dug into the ground to support wooden frames covered in hide, bark, or woven plant material, creating a secondary barrier against rain, positioned to funnel water away from the living space rather than into it. This wasn't a lean-to thrown together in a panic. This was architecture, angled roofing, waterproof layering, with animal fat rubbed into hides to repel water. Entry points positioned away from prevailing wind and rain direction. That's incredible, but it still doesn't explain the deeper problem. A shelter keeps you dry for one night. What happens when the rain doesn't stop for a week, a month, a season? If you're enjoying this investigation so far, do me a quick favor, smash that like button and drop a comment with your own theory on how they pulled this off. It genuinely helps this channel keep making these deep dives. Now, back to the mystery. That's when scientists uncovered something that changed the whole picture. Isotope analysis on ancient human bone, a method that reveals what people ate by examining chemical traces left behind in bone collagen, showed a dramatic shift in diet during prolonged wet periods. Not a small shift, a near total one. During these rain-heavy climate windows, ancient humans consumed drastically more fish, shellfish, and aquatic resources than at any other time. At first, this seems obvious. It's raining, so go to the water. But the deeper you look, the stranger this gets. Because relying on aquatic food during flooding isn't obvious, it's dangerous. Rivers become violent and unpredictable during heavy rain. Currents shift overnight. Riverbanks collapse without warning. So why would ancient humans choose the most dangerous water conditions of the year to go fishing? Here's the answer, and this is where the story takes its first major twist. Endless rain doesn't just threaten humans, it devastates every other food source at the same time. Grasslands flood, destroying root vegetables and seed plants. Herds of grazing animals migrate away from waterlogged land, taking meat sources with them. Nuts and dried fruit, critical stored calories, rot in humid air. One by one, every reliable food source disappears during long rain events. Except one. Rivers and lakes, as dangerous as they become, still contain food. Shellfish don't flee. Fish populations often increase in flood conditions, pushed into shallower water where they're easier to catch. For ancient humans, going toward the water wasn't a preference, it was often the only remaining option between survival and starvation. That single discovery reframes everything we thought we knew. Endless rain wasn't just a shelter problem, it was a total ecosystem collapse, and ancient humans had to identify in real time which food sources vanished and which ones didn't. But this raises an even bigger question. How did they know all this? How did people without written language, without science, without any modern understanding of ecosystems correctly predict which strategies would keep them alive? The evidence didn't fit a simple explanation. It wasn't just trial and error happening within a single lifetime. The risks were too high for that. Get it wrong once, and there's no second chance. So researchers started looking at something less obvious: social transmission. Knowledge passed down not through writing, but through repetition, imitation, and story. Communities that got it wrong didn't survive the next multi-year wet cycle. Communities that got it right passed their knowledge forward, verbally, physically, through repeated behavior modeled to children who watched their parents build hearths a certain way, store bark a certain way, move toward rivers at a certain point in the season. Over enough generations, trial and error becomes something that looks like almost foresight. In other words, what looks like ancient instinct was actually accumulated data, stored not in books, but in behavior. And this is where the major twist reveals itself. Because when researchers compared several ancient sites across different rainy regions of the world, from parts of Europe to Southeast Asia to the river valleys of ancient Africa, they found something nobody expected. Different populations with no contact with each other, separated by oceans and thousands of years, independently arrived at nearly identical survival strategies. Elevated hearths, waterproofed shelter coverings, sudden dietary shifts toward aquatic food during flood periods, stockpiled fire-starting materials gathered before the rains arrived. These weren't cultural coincidences, they were the same forced solution to the same forced problem, discovered again and again by different branches of humanity, thousands of miles apart with zero communication between them. Endless rain didn't just test human survival, it revealed something universal about human intelligence. An ability to solve identical environmental threats through independent observation, regardless of geography, language, or culture. Two groups of people who never met, who spoke no shared language, who lived on opposite ends of the planet, arrived at the exact same answer to the exact same problem. That single realization is the answer we've been building toward this entire video. Ancient humans didn't survive endless rain through luck, they survived through observation, adaptation, and cooperation. Reading water flow to position shelters, storing specialized materials before disaster hit, restructuring their entire diet as ecosystems collapsed around them, and passing every lesson forward so the next generation wouldn't have to relearn it the hard way. If even one of these decisions had failed, one bad hearth placement, one missed food source, one shelter built facing the wrong way, an entire family group could have been wiped out in days. Multiply that risk across generations, across dozens of rainy seasons, across every wet climate on Earth, and you start to understand just how much invisible knowledge it took simply to stay alive. And that brings us to the powerful truth hiding underneath this whole story. We tend to imagine our ancestors as fragile, primitive, barely scraping by against nature, some caveman stereotype, hunched, confused, reacting to the world instead of understanding it. But the deeper the evidence goes, the more it reveals the opposite. These weren't people surviving by accident, they were engineers, strategists, and ecological analysts, thousands of years before any of those words existed, and thousands of years before anyone wrote any of them down. The rain that should have ended them instead revealed exactly how capable the human mind already was. And maybe that's the real lesson buried in that 3-meter layer of ash. Long before writing, before cities, before science as we know it, humanity's greatest survival tool was never fire or shelter or food. It was the ability to watch, learn, and adapt faster than the world could kill them. It was the willingness to remember a lesson learned by someone else in another season, another storm, another lifetime, and to pass it on before it was lost forever. That's not primitive. That's the exact same intelligence that built everything we have today. If this story made you see cavemen differently, hit like, drop a comment telling me which detail surprised you the most, and share this with someone who thinks ancient humans were just lucky. They weren't. They were relentless. And somewhere out there, buried in ash and mud and forgotten riverbanks, the evidence is still waiting to tell us exactly how they did it.